Røikjer from Aalborg, Denmark. He receives the Gøran Sundkvist Young People Award for Clinical Science. A few words for Johan. Johan Røikjer is a medical doctor currently undergoing specialist training in immunology at Aalborg University Hospital, while also serving as an associate professor at Aalborg University. He graduated from Ursus University in 2017 and earned his PhD in early 2023, focusing on the functional evaluation of small nerve fibers in diabetes under the supervision of Professor Steno. Johan Røikjer's research is often multidisciplinary and translational, developed in close collaboration with medical engineers, clinicians from other specialties, and basic science. While his early work focused on advanced diagnostic techniques, his current research has broadened to include early detection and monitoring of diabetic neuropathy, as well as the development of individualized mechanism-based treatments for neuropathic pain. His long-term goal is to improve the management of diabetic neuropathy through a patient-centered approach, integrating novel diagnosis tools and cutting-edge technology with personalized treatment strategies to better address this complex and heterogeneous condition. Please, Johan, in congratulations.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you for coming for this section. And thank you for the kind introduction. I'm Johan, and I'm from Steno Diabetes Center, North Denmark in Aalborg. And this morning I will present to you my talk named Diabetic Neuropathy towards early detection and mechanism-based treatment. Before I get into the presentation itself, I would like to thank the Executive Committee of the Neuropathy for awarding me this prize and giving me the opportunity to stand before you here today. I am both proud and humbled. So, the agenda, I will start with a bit of background about my journey, how I got here from getting into research to standing on the podium today. I will then go into a brief scientific background and then into the meat and potatoes of this presentation, which will be on assessing small nerve fiber function using novel technologies. I will have a short conclusion and then I will reveal one or two ongoing studies in our research group. But starting off with the journey, it all started in beautiful Aalborg, where I actually came to do my residency in endocrinology. Here I met my mentor and now also good friend, Ivestigator, who quickly convinced me to drop my residency and instead go into diabetes research. We said it, and I have never looked back ever since. Before that though, it all started in Aalborg, where I educated a medical doctor in June 2017. I did my basic clinical training and then I went to Aalborg and met Niels. That ended up in a PhD focusing on small nerve fibers in the end. Then my PhD was actually going on during COVID, so there wasn't really many conferences to go to. Most of them were virtual. So I actually went to my first congress at the Neuropathy in beautiful Bergen in September 2022 and was lucky enough to be awarded the Young Investigators Award for Best Oral Presentation at that meeting. Intensive then contacted me a few weeks later and asked me to join the Neuropathy news team, of which I happily applied. Back at home, I finished my PhD and went into a postdoc position at Steno Diabetes Center and finally got starting on my residency in endocrinology. I was lucky enough to be appointed an associate professor at Aalborg University in June 2024, allowing me part-time research for the foreseeable future. And then last year, during the Neuropathy, I admitted or applied to join the Neuropathy committee and was admitted, and of that I am very happy. I lied before actually. I said my first conference was Neuropathy in Bergen. That wasn't actually true. My first conference was actually the Diabetic Foot Study Group all the way back in 2018. And during this conference, I was actually admitted into a group of young scientists mentored by several seniors with the ultimate goal of preventing the first ever diabetic foot ulcer. However, one of the mentors in this group was someone who spoke very, very passionately about neuropathy and told me how diabetic foot ulcers could only be prevented by preventing neuropathy. I don't know if Røikjer is in this group today, or if he even remembers. I don't know if you remember Røikjer, but you had me convinced. So just after this meeting, I went to Niels and said, Niels, I would like to change the topic of my PhD and go more towards the nerves. And of course, Niels was happy to do this. So I very quickly changed. I don't even think I started my PhD at this point. Since then, I have published a lot of different papers, mainly on neuropathy, a bit of papers on the diabetic foot also, and also on painful neuropathy. So that was a bit of background on how I got here, and now I'll go into the scientific background of this presentation. The first is something you all know, and I think we can do rather quickly. It's about diabetic peripheral neuropathy, and we all know it's a very common complication to diabetes. We all know that it can lead to hepatic pain, foot ulcers, as just mentioned, and lower extremity amputations. It's often diagnosed late, mainly due to lack of reliable clinical tests and also clinical endpoints. And in a clinical setting, we aim to identify loss of protective sensation and thus the risk of foot ulcers, rather than trying to do early detection of diabetic neuropathy. Many of the established tests we use in research, I have tried to summarize some of the main tests here. First of all, quantitative sensory testing, a highly time-consuming test that also has a very low reproducibility and high variation in healthy controls and also in people with diabetes. So it's very good on a group level, but not really good on an individual level. Then we have the skin biopsies, the histological gold standard for aggressive small fiber neuropathy. This method is quite good in several ways, but will never be a screening method. It's invasive and it requires highly specialized laboratories. And then corneal confocal microscopy, a non-invasive alternative, limited by lack of specificity towards diabetes, and also neither of these more novel technologies provide any information on nerve fiber function, but mainly relies on nerve fiber structure. So I actually wrote in my thesis, and I stand by this today. Adequate assessment of small nerve fibers is pivotal when striving for early detection of DBM. Current screening methods are either insufficient, time-consuming, or only address structural damage without providing information on nerve fiber function. And this justifies the development of new rapid measures that could be applied in a clinical setting. And thus, going into the main theme of the presentation today, how to adequately assess small nerve fiber function, and a method called perception threshold tracking. Now, before we get into the method perception threshold tracking, of which many of you are probably not familiar, we'll have to take a stop at threshold tracking. This was actually a method developed by Ivestigator and his colleagues in the late 90s in the United States. And this method is very different from many other electrophysiological measurements, as this allows for assessing membrane properties and actually indirectly looking at ion channels. This method is highly complex and it requires specialized labs, and it never really caught on outside highly specialized neurophysiological laboratories. This was one of the first papers I ever read, one of the first scientific papers I ever read, and I remember reading it maybe 20 times. And then I came to Niels and I said, Niels, I don't think research is for me. I don't understand anything about this paper. And I remember Niels just looked me in the eye and said, Johan, neither do I. I'm not sure if it's true, but at least I can be back on track and think, okay, I can do this. And today I think maybe I will present to you some of the key principles that I actually do understand after several years of study. One of the key concepts we have listed here is what's called the strict duration curve. This curve shows that if you want to electrically stimulate a nerve, you have to either increase duration or you have to increase intensity. We also see from this graph that we have the A beta, the large fibers first. This means that these fibers are more excitable than the small A beta and C fibers, and this means that most electrophysiological measurements will always measure large nerve fibers, as these will be activated before the small nerves. We also have two key principles here that we need to visit. One called the wheelbase, and that is defined as the minimum current of infinite duration that is needed to activate the nerve. That's this point on the slide. And then a less important concept here called the coaxia, which is the minimum time required to double the strength of the wheelbase. Now, this was the first concept, the strength duration curve. We also need to understand nerve fiber accommodation, another key principle in electrophysiology. This is defined as the nerve ability to adapt to a slowly racing or ramped impulse by increasing its activation threshold. Different nerve fibers have different accommodation properties, and this is based on the ion channel composition. I will come back to that in 1 second. All in all, large nerve fibers have a good ability to adapt, and small nerve fibers cannot adapt or accommodate. What I have tried to draw here is a picture of an action potential. We have a resting state membrane potential. We have a stimulation that is usually a squared pulse. If that pulse is either long enough or strong enough, it will reach the activation threshold and we will fire an action potential. After that, we will go into resting membrane state, and then, we're going to refractory period and then into resting membrane state. This will happen in large nerve fibers, it will happen in small nerve fibers. They will look the same if we do this square pulse. However, if we do a ramp pulse and thus try to trigger the accommodation properties of the different nerves, we will see a different response in large and small nerve fibers. The small nerve fibers, and I have tried to draw here schematically, the stimulation will be longer, but we will still reach the same activation threshold and fire the same action potential. This is due to small nerve fibers having persistent sodium channels which can remain open for as long as the stimulus duration exists. However, the large nerve fibers, they have transient sodium channels, and this means that the sodium channels will close if the stimulation is too long, and thus they cannot help contribute to the activation of the action potential. And this means that if we do a ramp impulse in the large nerve fibers, we will require more electricity to stimulate the nerve than if we do a square impulse. And however, the small nerve fibers, they will not care what type of stimulation we use. And this will come back to in a second why this is important. Now coming into perception threshold tracking, the technique I actually want to describe to you here today. This technique utilizes the fact that small nerve fibers, they penetrate the junction between the dermis and the epidermis, and they end as free nerve endings within the epidermis. We know this from skin biopsies. While the large nerve fibers, the A beta fibers, they terminate inside the dermis. Usually when you do electrophysiology, you will have what's here on your left. This is a stimulation on the skin. The stimulation will usually hit the epidermis, it will hit the dermis, and as I told you earlier, the large nerve fibers are more excitable than the small nerve fibers, and thus we will have an activation of large fibers. However, if you are able to do a current that is very, very superficial and very flat, and is only present in the epidermis, you can have a high electricity intensity near the termination of the small nerve fibers without the stimulation reaching the dermis. And this means that we can actually have a selective stimulation of small nerve fibers and thus do electrophysiology on the small nerves. This is how the setup could look in a clinical setting. I have taped my foot over here on the left, and what you see on the right are different stimulations. The different colors are different stimulation types, so some of them are ramp impulses, some are squares. That's not really important right now. But if we focus on the first one, the green one, you see what we do is that we slowly increase current intensity until we reach a perception threshold where the participant feels it. We then reduce the intensity of the current to go just below the threshold, and thus being able to find the threshold of a stimulation. This method was developed by medical engineers at Aalborg University. It was validated in medical students, but we took it to the clinic to see if it also worked in diabetes and if we were able to assess small fibers neuropathy in people with diabetes. We utilized the median cohort. Nils described it briefly earlier. It's a cohort consisting of 80 participants divided into 4 groups. We had a group with type 1 diabetes and painful DPN, a group with type 1 diabetes and painless DPN, a group with type 1 diabetes and low DPN, and a group of healthy controls. And this cohort is unique because it's not matched on a group level, it's matched on a 1-to-1-to-1-to-1 basis on ACE and 6, meaning each participant in each group have a corresponding participant in the other 3 groups, making it a very, very well-matched cohort. These are the demographical data. I will not bore you with this. This is just to show that they are indeed almost perfectly matched. Now, coming back to threshold tracking, perception threshold tracking, and the validation of this study, we wanted to make sure that we could actually indeed stimulate large and small nerve fibers irrespective of each other. And for that, we used the concept of accommodation, which I explained earlier. What you see here is the small nerve fibers in blue, the large nerve fibers in orange. And on the y-axis, we have the accommodation. If the accommodation is 100%, that means that the nerves do not care if we use a ramp impulse or a square impulse. And what you see here is that the small nerve fibers do not care. The accommodation is approximately 100%, no matter what stimulation type we use. while the large nerve fibers, they require approximately 100 or almost twice as much electricity to be stimulated if we use a random impulse compared to a square impulse. Thus validating that there is indeed two different nerve fibers that we are stimulating with different electrodes, and thus validating that our method can indeed selectively stimulate small nerve fibers. This is the result from the cohort. We see that the activation thresholds here defined as the wheel-based, the other concept I mentioned, shows that more electricity is required to stimulate the nerves of those with painful DPN, and that is significantly higher than those with ordinary painless DPN, and it's higher than people without DPN, and it's higher than controls. So this indicates that those with painful DPN have more severe peripheral neuropathy, thus requiring more electricity to stimulate their nerves than those with painless DPN. We also tried to test our methods validate it towards established measures. Here we compared it to neural nerve conduction velocity for the large nerve fibers and to the co-detection threshold for the small fibers. It had very good area under the curves, but I will say if you compare a method to an in-state method, you are not really able to do higher than this. And I said in the beginning that the co-detection threshold is not very good on an individual level, so our method might even be superior to this recalculator. I will soon leave electrophysiology, but before that I need to visit one more concept that's called habituation. And habituation is what happens when you keep stimulating the same nerve. If you stimulate the nerve over and over, you will see that you require more and more electricity to stimulate the nerve because it habituates. What can you say? You need more and more electricity to activate the nerve, the more you stimulate it. This was true for both small and large nerve fibers, with the small nerve fibers being more pronounced. So why was this important? Well, it told us that we need, if we want to do stimulation of the fibers, we needed a method that could rapidly assess the nerves so that the stimulus was not too long and thus it would cause habituation. The method I showed we used earlier was the middle one called the method of limits. Here we slowly increased the impulse intensity until we reached the perception threshold and we then lowered it again. However, we have developed this further and are now using a method called the SIGN method, which is the first one, that is based on Bayesian statistics. And what this method does is that it has a computer algorithm that will always give the current intensity that gives the most information. And this means it will stimulate above the threshold, below the threshold, and then it will converge towards something that is the threshold. And using this novel method, we can assess the perception threshold within 1 or 2 minutes and not 10 minutes, which it took before. I also, maybe I should say that this method looks primarily into a delta fibers and their function, but we also investigated a method that primarily looks into C fiber function, and that is called the histamine-induced axon reflex flare response. This method is shown here. What's happening is that you provide a stimulus to one of the 3 nerve endings of the C fibers. This will cause a response that will run towards the CNS, but it will also branch out to adjacent nerve fibers. This will cause the release of substances like CGRP and substance P, not only from the initial stimulation site, but also from adjacent sites. And this will cause what's called a primary hyperalgesia, or a flare, shown by reddening of the skin. This method was developed by our colleagues from the United Kingdom, and they primarily used local heating to evoke this response. In the initial protocol, this was something that took half an hour to do. I think they have been optimized it since. But we wanted to do something that's even simpler, where you don't need to standardize skin temperature and so on. So we wanted to see if we could evoke the same response using histamine. What we did was using a laser Doppler camera. We took histamine using a skin prick lancet and we put it on the foot. We then took a picture each minute for 15 minutes using this laser Doppler technique. And what we see is that we go from no flare to a flare. And the size of this flare is a surrogate marker for C fiber function. What we saw using the same groups from the median cohort was that our healthy controls here in the top had a markedly higher response, indicating better C fiber function than everyone with diabetes. We also saw that those with diabetes but without DPN had a response in the middle, and then people with painful and painless DPN had worse response than the others. What's really interesting here, to me, is the fact that people with type 1 diabetes without any detectable DPN had such a lower response than their comparative controls. This is the same data shown in the box plot, and you see there is some overlap, especially regarding those with and without pain. We have since optimized this technique so that it won't take 15 minutes to conduct the examination, but we are actually able to see differences between people with and without DPN already 6 minutes into the study. So I have 5 minutes left, and I'm coming up to the conclusion. For this, we will say that the histamine-induced axonal fixed flare response and perception threshold tracking, there are both methods that are able to do functional assessment of small nerve fibers in diabetes. One primarily looking at A delta fibers, the other primarily looking at CBA fiber function. Perception threshold tracking is a potential future screening candidate as it's very, very fast and easily applicable. But of course, we need further studies and maybe also further optimization of the technique before it's ready for any large-scale testing. Something I did not touch on in this presentation because I thought I had enough electrophysiology is the fact that perception threshold tracking can actually look at ion channel compositions also. You can do this by applying different stimulations with different shapes, and then you're actually able to look into different compositions of sodium channels and potassium channels within the nerve fibers. And this is maybe important because we know many hereditary conditions where we see an overrepresentation of, for example, NAP 1.7. And if we were able to detect changes like this in some subgroups with painful DPN, it might be a potential future therapeutic target in subgroups. So the last 2 minutes I will spend on one of our ongoing study. It's called the Neuropathy decay study. And that's a study where we want to test methods for early detection of DPN. The idea here is to identify a marker for early neuropathy like the microalbuminuria of the nerves. What we do here is a study of 200 people with newly diagnosed type 1 diabetes. We follow them from diabetes onset. I have said 10 years here, that is probably too little, and maybe it's 20 years. And over time, we expect some of them will develop clinically significant neuropathy. We will examine them one time each year with a vast array of different examinations. And then once we have a proportion that has developed clinically significant DPN, we hope to go back into the earlier years and see if some of the methods were indeed able to detect early DPN that they have developed. This list is some of the examinations we perform each year. It's not fulfilling, but at least some of them. We do standard neurological examinations. We do nerve conduction study. We do quantum sensory testing. We do perception threshold tracking, as just described. We do skin biopsies, not only with identification of intraepithelial nerve fiber density, but also with different region-related markers. We do coronal control microscopy. We do MRI scans, including fMRI scans and PCI scans. We do blood-borne biomarkers, and we do different questionnaires. And with that was a brief summary of at least some of the research we do at our research neuropathy group in Steno in North Denmark. Once again, thank you to my mentor and close friends, Ivestigator, and to all my collaborators, both internationally and locally. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johan. Congratulations, please stay.
Yes.
If there is any question about your work. Okay. I can see any. So congratulations again, and please stay with the